When I got to film school, that was a perfect place for me to be exposed to a lot of different kinds of film. You've got to remember, in those days, there was no VHS, there was no DVD, and if you wanted to see a particular movie, it either had to come to some art house, you had to see it at 2 o'clock in the morning on television, or you could see it at film school. It was really through a lot of friends at USC, especially John Milius, who was a huge Kurosawa fan. He said, they're showing Seven Samurai, you've got to go see this, you've got to go see this. So I went in and saw Seven Samurai and was just completely blown away by it. It really had a huge influence on my life in terms of seeing something that brilliant and something that emotional and at the same time so exotic.
I can remember in the 50s there was the beginning of an art house movement in the suburbs of New York, where I was raised on Long Island, and that's where I first saw many of the films, national cinema films coming from around the world, and it seemed at that time that there were three giants, Fellini, Kurosawa, and Bergman. And of course, with Kurosawa, the first films I remember seeing were the samurai pictures. But then in rapid order, there were so many other fabulous films. And it seemed to me that Kurosawa was a man who had made, many masterpieces as opposed to, one or two.
I was very much enamored with visual cinema, which is what I'd been exposed to in San Francisco with the underground movement. So that was also what was being taught at USC at the time, and we studied a lot of very visual films. Kurosawa is a very, very visual director. That really struck me at the time.
The kind of violence was depicted in almost a poetic, surprising way that seemed to stem from those moments which startled you with violence, and yet it went beyond just being gruesome, but being stunning and dramatic and embody the moment that was supposed to be expressed. And that became a style really, I would say, originating from Kurosawa through certainly Peckinpah, but Bonnie and Clyde, my own film, The Godfather. I think you could trace a line backwards from The Godfather to Bonnie and Clyde to Kurosawa.
The great thing about Japanese cinema, it has a tendency to be a little more formal than other Western cinema, which means that the framing and everything gets to be a little bit more precise. And I happen to love Japanese art, so I like the purity and the cleanliness of the frame. I love that about Japanese cinema. It's a cultural artifact that comes out of the art form, the way they see things and the way they draw things. But Kurosawa was very good with that. Plus, he had the kind of Western influences. In talking to him, he was extremely influenced by John Ford. And that, having met John Ford and then met Kurosawa, John Ford was very enamored with Kurosawa. So, it's a great kind of thing to see the same kind of influences going on in that generation that are going on in my generation at that time, and now I see in the younger generation.
I first met Akira Kurosawa in Tokyo at a time in his own career after a period of depression or inactivity that began with the incidents concerning Tora Tora Tora. He had been the director of the Japanese language sequences, and due to difficulties or disagreements, he left that film, was replaced, and ultimately, I understand, was in a period of sadness and depression, was unable to put together a personal film and was short on money. This time coincided with my own kind of emergence with films like The Godfather, and at a time when I was successful, and then my colleague George Lucas was very successful in the international cinema.
I first met Kurosawa through Francis, and one Sunday, Francis had a get-together. The instant we met, we could carry on a complete conversation about making movies, because it's a funny thing, which is when you get two directors together, no matter where they're from, no matter what language they speak, they relate to each other completely. We know about shooting schedules, we know about lenses, we know about the problems of shooting, we know I'm going to shoot this on the beach, and oh my God, to get the horses onto the beach and the thing. You have a complete arena in which to talk and share stories, and we began to discuss what he was doing in film. He hadn't made a film in 5 years, and that was a tragedy to all of us that loved Kurosawa. I felt of him, well, that he was a great resource, that the more films he made, the more we got to learn about how to make films. And no matter what he did, whether they were successful, not successful, good or bad, we could always learn something from him.
The notion was put forth that I believe if George Lucas, after his great success in Star Wars, and myself would present his film, that we could go to a film company, and with that package of George Lucas and Francis Coppola presenting a new film of Akira Kurosawa, that might swing getting the finance. And of course we were anxious to help. This had happened to me before, really, in the early days of Zoetrope, when we tried to gain financing for Orson Welles, who was in a similar situation 10 years before, of wanting to make a film and not being trusted by the studios. And in that case, we tried to support Orson Welles to make a new film. And of course, we didn't have any prestige really at that time. But 10 or 15 years later, 12 years later, we did. And the same notion came up in regard to Mr. Kurosawa. And we said, yes, of course, we would like to. And the film was Kagemusha. And no doubt, now that as I think, Fox was the company that had done Star Wars. And so it probably was George who was the instrumental one in just saying, hey, do the Kurosawa film, because at that point Star Wars had saved and had greatly embellished Fox's prestige. And I think anything George would have said to them, they would have done.
When 20th Century Fox came into the production, he had already prepared it. He was all ready to go. And Toho was short $1.5 million or something like that. They weren't going to go unless they could come up with this money. They couldn't sell the foreign rights because nobody bought Japanese films. And so it was really a way of just saying, look, let's get this film made, give Toho the money they need to finish it. And 20th Century Fox obviously did it. They didn't expect to make any money out of it. They did it as a favor to me. And basically, when it happened between Alan Ladd Jr. and myself. I simply said, I need a favor. Sort of the Godfather. Do this for me. I need it. And he said, okay, I'll do it. During the period of what we call development hell, which is where you sit there and wait for your movie to get a go-ahead, but it never does, I think to keep himself sane, he basically storyboarded the whole movie and did paintings and to keep himself calm in all the indecisions that were going on.
He was very kind and very gracious with us, very generous with us. He gave each of us some of the beautiful watercolor pictures that he had made, which we both treasure to this moment. Because all of the uniforms and the banners and the attire was all there in these paintings, and I have quite a few of them, maybe a dozen in total, and they were figures in armor or other characters. Clearly he was extremely adept at this. I mean, his painting just seemed so sure how he could indicate a little cauldron of coals and a fire with a couple of simple lines. So he was a master in that form. In those days, when we were going to serve as executive producer or in some way help Orson Welles make a film or any of these, to us, illustrious names, we didn't say, well, let's see the script. It was really not a matter of that. It was more, well, of course he should make another film. We always rushed to the theater when Kurosawa had a new film, but I was told that it was called Kagemusha and it was starring Katsu, who was famous for the Zatoichi series of The Blind Swordsman.
The casting is always a big issue when making movies. It's really a very important part of the directing process.
We weren't really asked our opinion on whether or not Katsu or Nakadai was going to play the part. Certainly Katsu at that time was a big name. People were really looking forward, anticipating a collaboration with Katsu and Mr. Kurosawa. And of course I was then told that there was a big falling out and that Katsu, who was perfect casting for that part, was not going to play the part because the maestro had gotten angry at him. And when you think of what the story is about, you pluck some guy and you put him in there, you want something really that he's going to do things that are really unpredictable, that belie the counterfeit he's supposed to portray. And that's what Katsu was. One of the elements of Katsu's personality was humor, a kind of Rabelaisian gusto. I mean, I think he was a figure of a great, I mean, you know the story of why he got fired, don't you? And he went to the rehearsal with a video camera, and when Kurosawa asked him, "What are you doing?" he says, "I'm making my film on my acting classes, and I'm going to shoot how you direct me." And Kurosawa says, "You can't do that." And he said, "Well, yes, I can." And it was just the madness of doing something so outrageous that Katsu would have made him really good in that role. Nakadai was a very classical actor, and he did what Kurosawa wanted, which was to be totally under Kurosawa's control, whereas Katsu would never have been under Kurosawa's control, and that's what the role, I think, needed. So my view is colored, and maybe unfairly.
You know, I like the movie quite a bit, and it's hard to say what would have happened if a different actor had played that role, and what he would have brought to it in terms of what it actually turned out.
Shingen Harunobu ではない。その影帽子、Kagemushaじゃ。お戯れを。
There's always a revelation that happens when you watch another director shoot. I really did want to spend a fair amount of time with him to learn as much as I could, because that was my golden opportunity. I like to shoot with a lot of cameras. Kurosawa shoots with a lot of cameras. So for me, I was very interested in how he was managing many cameras. And I was watching a lot of it. I was watching the battle scenes, which everybody uses a lot of cameras. But how he placed them, the lenses he used, and how he staged things was very interesting to me. But he would even do some of the quieter scenes with multiple cameras. And he was very good at that. He also, I discovered, you know, would shoot during the day, and then when he finished shooting, he would go and cut the film, which I couldn't even fathom doing. I mean, I'm so tired at the end of the day, I couldn't think about cutting. But here he was, 74 years old, and he was, you know, doing what I couldn't do at 40.
We were out in some area of, I think it was Hokkaido, in the north, and there were a large number of horsemen, and they were to go from left to right, and they did it several times. And the big moment that day was that Nakadai fell off the horse, and everyone was concerned whether he was hurt. And I think they stopped shooting until they could figure out if he had broken any bones or not, and then they continued to shoot some other things with the horsemen. Kurosawa had planned it very carefully, and they were now executing the plan.
He would use the storyboards as an inspiration. Sometimes he would do it pretty much exactly, and a lot of times he would just use that as an inspiration to go to the next level in the way he was shooting it. The big difference that came out of Kagemusha on, that he had explored a little bit earlier, was the use of color, which he had. Most of his films, early films, were black and white. So it was, you know, a much more austere and simplistic way of looking at the image. You add the dimension of color, and I think in the end, especially with Kagemusha, he was able to really revel in the fact that he had this element to work with. And I think the color is beautiful in Kagemusha. I mean, there's shots of messengers running through stairs and things that are just poetry in terms of a visual way of looking at things. There's things of in rooms with the snow out the window, and it's just so pristine and beautiful. There images that sear themselves into your mind.
I think the staging was quite beautiful, and of course the handling of those scenes in court where the politics was going on with this figure, the color, the command of creating the world of that period.
The strength of this film really has to do a lot with Kurosawa. He always has a great story to tell. That's the core of what these movies are all about. And it's usually a story that's very emotional and works no matter what culture you're from, even though it's steeped in a very esoteric period in Japanese history. You get this automatic connection between this bum, basically, thief, and the role he gets to play. And it's just a great story. All of his films have great stories to tell. He's able to tell them, I think a lot of it's visual. And I think it's important that you, as a filmmaker who has some power, help the younger filmmakers and the older filmmakers, because they both have things to teach you.
Whereas America has this tradition of filmmakers embracing, I mean, Marty Scorsese embracing Paul Schrader or what have you. We really believe there was this tradition of getting newer directors or older directors to be given the opportunity, wherever talent was, to try to point to it and make it and help it facilitate its progress.
There's, always a number of these, icons of cinema that can't get work and that still want to make a movie. And I think it's important to allow that to happen, because the system doesn't really accommodate that. It's very narrow, and they're very reluctant to let young people in, and they're very quick to drop people who seem to have gone past the chic of the day.
There's an interesting question when you think of like a truly great filmmaker, and certainly Kurosawa is one of the greatest. And the classic work so well in the case of Yojimbo Sanjuro, in the case of period samurai pictures, the Seven Samurai. You look at the newer work, which is the work more contemporary, or you might have been there when they were making it. And there's always this feeling, and I think it's a phenomenon of time. It's like looking at old photographs in your family, and the old photographs from the 50s have so much depth and luster and magic, and yet it's the same photograph that when it was contemporary. I think, of course, the work of a master like that, the great work that brought him to the fore, just are the classics. And the newer work, unless it's like totally some groundbreaking work, tend to always seem like, well, the great person is doing it again and it's wonderful and it's great, but it's not at the level of those classics. I think we all suffer from that. So I think when an artist such as Kurosawa goes back to a vernacular or a genre that he had made classics in earlier, it's always that big question is how many artists really can totally reinvent themselves in later life, the way Shakespeare did or the way Verdi did, and only a real handful of people totally reinvent what they were doing. And I think all artists want to reinvent themselves each moment of their contemporary life. Some can do it, very few can do it. Whether or not Kurosawa really did it, it's a wonderful film, and maybe perspective could truly answer that question.